Well, good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Well, I'd like to take a moment and introduce myself. My name is Michael Forney. It's my privilege to be with you guys today. I love partnering with Jesus in the work of the mission, and I'm just really grateful to Ben Tolley and to Bishop Kendall for allowing me to partner with Jesus here in the Gateway Conference. So I serve in the Southern Michigan Conference as the Assistant Superintendent of Leadership Development and Multiplication, and I also lead a company called Gravitational Leadership, and we're working with around 300 or so pastors in, I think we're running 7 cohorts right now across the country, called in a forum called the Turnaround Church Coaching Network. And we are partnering with the Gateway Conference to make that available to pastors that would like to be a part of that. It's for lead pastors and their spouses if they would like to come. But it's lead pastors only, it's not teams. And if you would like more information about that, there's some brochures in the back you can pick up. Talks a little bit more about the Turnaround Church Coaching Network. And there's a website on there where you can call and register. The pricing is already half off for Free Methodist pastors, but I know that Ben wants to partner with you in this, so if you'd like to join that, I know the conference will help subsidize as well if that's something that you're interested in. It's held up at Somerset Beach Camp in southern Michigan, and an overnight stay is part of the whole thing, so if you'd like more information about that, I just wanted to make that available to you. Well, just to give you a little bit about my story, I was privileged to pastor a turnaround church in a very rural community in Washington State. If you're familiar with Washington State, it was about 2 hours north of Wenatchee. So up in the middle of nowhere, I took a church of 21 and a town of 1,000. And being young and idealistic, I promptly grew it to 3. And then from there, we were able to see the Lord move, and we were, in our 7 years there, we're able to grow the church about 275 in average attendance with 4 different kinds of services. And one of our largest services was a Hispanic service as well. So we were reaching multi-ethnic, multi-social social strata, and economic strata in our community, and it can be done, even in rural contexts. We were really rural. The closest town is about 2 hours away, and closest big town. And the exciting thing, I was so thrilled. The first week I stepped into that pastorate, the largest employer in town laid off 397 people, town of 1,000, and closed their doors. So lots of challenges there, but where the need is great, God is greater. Amen? And this can be done in any context at all. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about life cycle, just briefly, kind of refresh. Many of you probably already understand church life cycle. I'm just going to give a brief overview on that. And then I'm going to talk about the reverse life cycle for a turnaround church. Because a turnaround church has its own life cycle, and it's important to understand what's happening in that context as you're leading it. Otherwise, it's really easy to get discouraged. Because my experience as a turnaround pastor, when I grew the church backwards, I got really depressed. I was thinking, what am I doing wrong? But the truth of the matter is, if you're going to do a turnaround church, you're probably going to lose some people at first. And the key idea is to lose the right people. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. So most of you have probably seen a slide like this. Lots of folks in the church world have taught about this. Gary McIntosh, a friend of mine, has done a lot of work around life cycle. So the basic idea here is that every organization has a starting, and when it starts, its mission is clear, and there's this upward momentum as the organization grows. At some point, they become established. Momentum stops being as great, and that starts to cause a plateau where the maximum effectiveness of that organization is reached. They become institutionalized and eventually disintegrate. And that's the life cycle of every organization, natural life cycle, if there's no intentional intervention. It used to be that life cycle in the life of a church was commonly took about 50 years. That has changed as the pace of change in general culture has accelerated. So we'll talk about that a little more. But really there's about 4 quadrants that happen in this life cycle of a church. I just want to walk through them really briefly. In this quadrant 1, which is this kind of lower corner, right after the church is getting started and the dream is fresh and momentum is beginning to build, this time in an organization's life, in a church's life, there's a compelling vision. There's a common mission. Everybody's working hard towards the same goal. They all share the same dream, and there's this growing identity and a sense of things that are happening and a growing sense of community that takes place in the church. And then as the church gets a little bit more established, sort of in the second quadrant of the life cycle, churches start to experience a little more mature growth. They start to figure things out and establish some structures to support the growth that's occurring. And usually that's in the form of programs and systems and administration. Maybe we're adding new leaders and that kind of thing. So there starts to be more formal processes involved in the life of the church. Then as we move into this maximum effectiveness stage, as we start to lose momentum and get into plateau or initial decline, what happens here, I get asked very frequently, how do we know when we've moved from established to maximum effectiveness? I can do this in shorthand. It's really, really easy. Whenever the methods become more important than the mission, that's the very moment that you've started to plateau or decline as a church. Okay, that's what starts to happen here. All these programs and systems and administration that we put into place in quadrant 2 that to help us really capture this growth and sustain this growth will start to become super important, and the focus and commitment of the folks in the church kind of shift away all of a sudden from mission and culture, and that kind of vision starts to decrease, and the programs and the systems and the leadership start to be the focus. And when that begins to happen, that results in a loss of momentum and energy, and the church starts to plateau or decline. Now, when you hit quadrant 4, you're way over here now. You've started to decline pretty rapidly, and this is where the community and the systems are just falling apart. And at this stage, it's very, very difficult actually to revitalize the church. Once it's there, it's almost always a relaunch because people become more and more desperate as this decline starts to happen. People in the church become more and more desperate to hold on to their role, to control. And the loss of vitality really begins to cause a loss of viability in the church, and the church dies. Because the focus of the church becomes survival. It's all about paying the bills. It's all about preserving the methods. And so at this stage, very, very quickly, oftentimes, it will decline and fall away. Right now, the way the pace of change is in our culture, the church life cycle has shrunk. And so this is really a 10 to 20 year cycle now. Naturally, if all things are equal and there's no intentional leadership to the opposite. So this has become a lot shorter. I'm going to tell you that this is getting shorter every year. And the reason for that is the pace of change in our culture is accelerating very, very rapidly. So because of the pace of change, people are in and out of churches more quickly. There's less established clientele or less established membership in a church. And so these things can happen at a much quicker level. In fact, some sociologists will tell you that the millennials are the last generation that they're going to be able to study because the pace of change is so quick. It's literally, what do people believe today that they didn't believe differently than they believed yesterday? So there's not even enough time for a generation to have common characteristics in our culture. And so often that's accelerating this kind of organizational change. Ed Stetzer and others that study the church in America say that you can lose missional momentum in a church today in as little as 3 weeks. Okay, so this is why it's really important to focus on the mission of the church. Because if this first, or right up here, this vertical line right there where it's between established and maximum effectiveness, right there is the moment where mission takes a back seat to methods. And that's where the decline really starts. It's kind of deceptive because what the cause of what puts a church into decline precedes when the fruit of decline starts to happen, right? So we kind of disconnect ourselves from the things that cause the church to decline because we don't see the fruit of it right away. In fact, there's a period of growth still that happens even though the cause of death is already in place. And so it's really important as you're leading a turnaround church, or just honestly, if your church is vibrant and growing, one of the most important things as a leader in that church that you can do is keep your pulse on the mission. Is the most important thing in our church the mission of Jesus, or have we already started elevating our preferences? Have we started elevating our programs? Have we started elevating the methods and the things that we do above the mission of Jesus? Because the very second that happens is when we start to decline. In the business world, they call this means-ends inversion. It's what happens when we start living to live instead of living for the purpose that we were created. And frankly, all organizations go through this, not just churches. Lots of businesses start with this great idea, and over time they forget what it is, and they fall apart. This same cycle happens. It's almost like this is the second law of thermodynamics for organizations. If there's not intentional intervention, this is what will occur. But can I just encourage you, this isn't fatalism. This isn't God's plan for the church. This is just what will happen if we don't have intentional leadership. But you're all in this room because that God has called you to be intentional leaders in His church. And you can do something about this, and so hopefully you will. Right at these two junctures in time are the most critical, pivotal moments in the life cycle. You can start a new up. You can avoid decline by starting a new up in momentum anywhere on this life cycle. It's just easier at certain places. And so anywhere on this side of the life cycle, it's easier to start a new up because that's where all the momentum is. You're already on the way up, so you can keep that forward motion going. Once you start to plateau, it becomes a lot harder because now you're starting to create energy. But when you start to get into the decline, now you're having to reverse energy. And so it takes a lot of energy to reverse that momentum and get a new up. So when you have something that's going down like this and you're trying to create a new up, when you start to create that new up, what's still going to happen before you get up? You're going to go down. You're going to go down. So one of the things that we train turnaround church pastors in is to recognize that if you're doing the things that are going to bring your church back to missional life, it's also going to probably cause your church to decline. Because the people that are at your church who care more about their preferences than the mission of Jesus, the people that are at your church that want this to be a club that caters to them, that want to control the church so that their desires and their needs get met, instead of being willing to serve the mission of Jesus and do what he wants to move that mission forward, those people are going to leave. And can I just say, praise Jesus? Because they're not on the mission of Jesus. They're not disciples of Jesus. They're not Christ followers. They are adherents of the gospel, meaning they understand there was a Jesus, they believe that he lived, they believe this. But that belief stops at an intellectual level, and they have not placed their trust in Jesus, because when you place your trust in Jesus, that's evidenced by following Jesus. And so you follow Jesus into the mission. Our job as pastors, as leaders in the church, is not to build a bunch of adherents who have said a prayer and who give mental assent to the gospel. Our job as pastors in the church is to build disciples who are willing to lay down their preferences, pick up their cross, and follow Jesus in his mission. And so as we do that, that's going to create some problems. When you start to get in this downward area, a lot of pastors start acting out of fear. So a lot of times in the cohort, what I get from pastors who are in that decline phase is they say, man, if we start doing that, people are going to leave the church. And I say to them, yes. And if you don't do that, people are going to leave the church, and the church is going to die. And so it's really important to make good decisions that are going to reverse this momentum and help the church find new life. So we want to create these new ups as much as we can. These are the 2 points in time that it's easiest to do it. One when you're still going up, and then one right before you start really going down, because once you get over that, it starts to get a lot harder. Now, I want to just reiterate, there is really no place except for over here that you can't turn around a church. Over here, you are going to have to relaunch a church because you've lost vitality. You've lost viability. But for the most part, most churches can be turned around. So if your church is under 200 in average attendance, then if you have less than 10% increase, or if you have 10% increase or more, you're a growing church. If you have less than 10% increase annually, you're starting to be in that phase of maximum effectiveness, right? Remember where we talked about you're still growing, but you're starting to plateau. So it's something to keep in mind. Okay, now's the time to start a new up, because it gets harder as we go on. If you have less than 10% in either direction, then you're in that plateaued phase, and that's the best time. Somewhere right there, just start a turnaround. If your church is larger, how many people pastor churches larger than 200? Anybody? Okay, so if your church is over 200 in average attendance, then this number is a little smaller, okay, because of the way church dynamics go. If it's 5% or more, you're growing. If it's less than 5%, you've started to move into that maximum effectiveness phase. And so you're going to want to do everything, because right then is the best time. That's the best time to start a new up. You won't have any other time that will require less energy than that moment. So great time to do that. If you have less than 5%, then you're starting to decrease. And so you're starting to be in that plateau and decrease. So let's talk about the turnaround life cycle, because the turnaround life cycle looks like this. And everybody's like, yay! The turnaround life cycle looks like this. Now, when you start the new up in one of those pivotal places, if you're able to start the new up right at the moment before you move into maximum effectiveness, right at that first place, you're not going to see a very big dip, right? Because you're already in that upward momentum. You might see a little slackening, but then you can start back up again. The further over in the church life cycle that you're in, this could be a bigger dip. And so you need to have awareness of that so that your expectations are correct. So we're going to talk about 9 phases really quick of a turnaround church. You're not going to be able to get the full meal deal here. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the Gateway Conference and Gravitational Leadership are partnering with the Turnaround Church Coaching Network. And so if you'd like to be a part of that, we are still allowing people to jump in here in May and June. It's up at Somerset Beach Camp in Michigan, and there's super great pricing for Gateway Conference. There's some brochures in the back. Happy to talk about that with you at a later point. So the first phase is called induction. This is just where sort of the first elements of awareness, our mission has started to slip here, and our programs and our methods have become more important. So right here at the very beginning of this, there needs to be a commitment to address the problem. Now, at this point, nobody's going to think it's a problem because you're still growing, right? So everybody's like, why do we need to go through this pain? Well, a smart leader knows we need to go through this pain because now it's not going to be that much pain. And if we don't do this, we're committing to our own death. So an accountable leader seeks the truth. And so I really want to encourage you, those of you that are in lead chairs or that are nearby, the temptation at this stage is to make excuses. You start to see a little bit of loss of momentum and, well, it's an off Sunday, or we saw this or we saw that. And so the temptation is to start to make excuses and kind of can I just encourage you? The facts are what they are. When you can see what's happening, you can do something about it. We have a statement that we talk about with all of our pastors, and it's this: sight is life. What you can see, you can lead to. So don't fall into the trap of the enemy that would have you blind your eyes to bad news. Because bad news that you see is something you can lead to. And really want to encourage you to be accountable in that way. So at this stage, this is where we're gathering information. What's going on here in our church? We're grabbing historical data, graphs, stories. The pastor gains credibility in this phase, which you're going to need as you move forward, by listening and asking really good questions. So this isn't about trying to convince people at this part of the turnaround. You're really just listening and observing and saying, what is happening? And then you need to identify key influencers at this stage. We all have influencers in our church that aren't on our cabinets or who aren't on the board of administration. And if you're new to that church context, you need to identify who those people are, because it's going to be really important as you walk through this process. If you've been in the church for a while, you have the advantage of already knowing who these people are. And so that will serve you really well through the turnaround process. So as you begin to do this exploration and gather this information, you start to have a fuzzy view, a fuzzy strategy of what's going to be needed to turn around the church. So a question you could ask is, what does your history tell you about your church? What have you learned by looking at the trailing indicators? So When you look at statistics that are trailing, they tell you what did happen. We also need to have a few leading indicators which tell us what is going to happen. We'll talk about that a little later on. So phase 2 is the introduction phase. So this is where you start doing some initial teaching about why the mission of Jesus is important, about what kind of changes we're going to need to make to get back into the mission of Jesus. And you begin to give new information. You begin to focus the church again on the mission of Jesus, that he gave the church. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this talk, but some of you came in a little bit later, Ed Stetzer says that you can lose missional importance in just 3 weeks as a church. So keeping the church focused on the mission is something you should be doing all the time. But this phase is where you're taking a special emphasis there. And the biblical mandate of being outwardly focused is something that you're either introducing if you're coming into a new context, or you're reintroducing if this is a church that you have led. The church is the only organization in the world that was founded for people that don't belong to it. Jesus said, I didn't come for the well, I came for the sick. And he gave us that same mandate to go into all the world and make disciples. So we need to reintroduce that theology. If you don't have a mission statement, this is the time where you start to develop a mission statement. Don't feel like you have to develop a mission statement. The FMC mission statement is great. Don't feel like you've got to go to all this work necessarily. Here's what you need to really understand. Your church needs to have a mission, not a mission statement. Okay? There's lots of organizations with mission statements on the wall that don't mean anything. Okay, so what we really need is a mission. And so you've got to take your people through a process where they own the mission of Jesus, where they have embraced it and they're willing to sacrifice for it, they're willing to make decisions, they're willing to lay down their preferences for the cause of Christ. That's what this phase is all about. So when you're developing a mission, you start with the pastor and the lead team, whatever that means in your context. Please don't try to do this by yourself. I can't tell you how many times I've had pastors leading through a turnaround church process that they think, oh, we need a mission statement. They go in their office, they come out a half an hour later with the statement, and they have a mission statement and no mission. You've got to do this with people because they have to sweat over it. They have to work hard on it so that they'll own it, right? So take your people through a process, and honestly, this can take time. Most people just want to cut to the end because they don't want to do the hard work. But can I just encourage you, don't short-circuit this process. Because if you do, you won't have the culture necessary to catalyze people around the mission. If you can't even get your leaders catalyzed around the mission, there is no way you're going to get your congregation catalyzed around the mission. So start with the lead team. Teach on it often. Talk about it. Have open conversations about it. One of the things you will find if you have honest dialogue about this with your lead team is you don't all mean the same thing when you say love God. You don't all mean the same thing when you say love people. You don't all mean the same thing when you say disciple. People have different ideas of what that means. Take the time to come into agreement on what that means. By the way, if you do that with your lead team, it will streamline decisions in the future. You will save lots of time and angst if you come together on the mission, because if you're in agreement on the mission, decisions are easy, right? Because now we're just comparing them up against the mission. So don't short-circuit this process. So you want to start with your pastor and your lead team. You want to move to key ministry leaders. and allow them to clarify and chime in. So let's say you're working with your lead team. You're going to bring it to your ministry leaders in Jell-O, right? Not in concrete. You want to bring it to them in Jell-O, and then as you talk about it more, you may want to fine-tune it. You're probably not going to overhaul it, but you're going to fine-tune it. And then this group of people becomes the guiding coalition, which is going to help you get this out into your congregation. So some observations based on mission. The church does not exist for its members. It exists for its non-members. And we need to constantly help people understand that. Jesus said, I didn't come for the well, I came for the sick, and he asks us to partner with him in that mission. He asks us to make disciples of everyone. So we need to help the church understand this isn't a club that's about them. This is about them coming into mission and partnership with Jesus to reach a world that is far from him. So as you begin to do that, leadership tension can ramp up because the gospel becomes personal. You're not just asking me, do I believe in Jesus? You're asking me, do I believe in Jesus enough to listen to that bass player? Well, that didn't even get a laugh. Come on now. Listen to that drummer or whatever the situation is. Am I willing to lay down my preference of music so that my grandkids can come to faith in Jesus? Am I willing to be flexible with what church service looks like so that people that are far from Jesus can engage with him in service and come to trust him, even though I still like singing from a hymnal or sitting in a pew instead of a chair, or whatever it is in your context? Whatever that preference is, when you start putting the mission up against it, tension happens. That's good. That's good. Pastors, when you create healthy tension, it moves people forward. It helps them to grow. Don't be afraid of healthy tension. Be afraid of toxic tension, or not afraid of it, but watch for it. So either a survival or club culture needs to be identified, and it needs to be placed in contrast to a mission-based culture. So what you're going to do is not say, okay, all you people right now have this really bad culture and we need to have this one, because that doesn't work very well. It just puts you at odds with them. But to say, we have an opportunity in front of us. We can become a club that's really happy and not reaching anybody, becoming totally irrelevant and eventually dying. Or we have the opportunity to partner with the living God in helping bound people become free, experience peace, love, and joy through the power of the Holy Spirit. God has invited us into that process. What are we going to do? Well, I don't know about you, but I want to be a part of that second process. So experimenting with outreach begins slowly. Often early on, you're going to have limited results. Make sure you set that up as normal, right? When you start trying new things and reaching out, you're not going to win every single time because we're learning. And so learning is a win. So then we move into the obstruction phase. And so from here kind of over to the reconstruction phase, this is a high tension point. The tension in the room is going to get really high because resistance starts to emerge. Both passive resistance, people that are like, yeah, pastor, and then they don't do anything. And then your active resistors, you know who they are because they're sending you emails and calling you on the phone and leaving you treats, slashing your tires, whatever it is. So that actually happened. Well, never mind. Another story. So, you have this resistance that starts to emerge because the gospel is confronting them. It's confronting them. Am I going to choose to follow Jesus, or am I going to choose my own comfort or preference? So, leave some space there for people to wrestle. Recognize that all resistance isn't rebellion. There's a process sometimes that people have to go through. So, mission-based changes at this phase, you're going to get some mixed results because they're not going to be necessarily wholehearted at this phase into the mission. So don't give up at this point in time. People are confronted with choosing either this is my church here to serve me, or this is Christ's church here to reach the lost. Resistance is based on personal impact. I don't want to give up this program. It's been really meaningful in my spiritual experience. We can't let it go. We have to, never mind, there's only 2 people in it. We still need to give to it and sustain it because it was meaningful to me. But what if we give it away, and instead we're able to pivot and reach people that we haven't reached before? Well, that's personal, and so you start to have resistance. So here, it's really important for repeated vision casting. You're almost constantly pulling people back to the mission. As a leader, you're starting to get sick of hearing yourself talk about the mission and the vision of what we're trying to build, that culture that we're trying to build. But as you do, the obstructions come to the surface because all this resistance is going to come up, and you're going to be able to deal with it and give people the opportunity to follow or not. Not everybody is going to follow, so just be aware of that. But leaders must be able to discern between minor, moderate, and major obstructions and then deal with the most critical ones first. Listen, there will be people that will be resisting. They don't need you to get in an argument with them. They just need time to process with Jesus. You know, there are other people, they're going to split the church, and they need to be dealt with because they're on a different mission, and you need to confront them. And so having discernment is important. Staying focused on the mission will move you forward. And so this resistance is part of developing a new culture focused on reaching lost people. How many of you have worked out this week? Well, maybe I shouldn't ask that question. Don't raise your hand. But if you've ever worked out, you know that your muscles, in order to gain new conditioning, have to be met with resistance. And so the strength of the mission and the strength of the commitment of the people moving forward is directly related to the resistance they face. And so if they're facing personal resistance, if they're facing resistance in the collective church, and they have to work really hard to build this new culture, I can tell you something, they're going to fight for that new culture. They're not going to want to go back to the way that it was because they're going to be holding on to this new thing. This is both a blessing and, as we see later, an obstacle. So now we have to do the destruction. This is where developing the strategic stops. So what I mean by that is we need to figure out what we're going to stop doing in order to do the new things that we need to do to get a different result. So you all know we can't get a different result by doing the same things. And so we can't just keep adding things because we have limited resources. And so here we get to decide, what are we going to stop? And we have to be willing to stop doing the wrong things or even stop doing good things that are keeping us from doing the best things. And so this can get tense, especially because the reason that we're plateaued or in decline is because people like their things. And so what are you going to stop doing? But can I just say to you, your church is perfectly designed for the results that you're getting. So if you hang on to the design, you're going to hang on to the results. If you want different results, you're going to have to change. So there is both a public and a private price tag with each of these decisions. Public because each decision invites criticism. Private because each decision contains an emotional price tag. You know what? It's not just everybody else's favorite programs that might have to die. Sometimes they're ours as well. So we move from that into the construction phase. This is where we've kind of got everybody who we think, actually. We've got everybody now on mission. Now we start to build. What are we going to do? Still high tension, because now we start to have competing vision for what's forward, right? So people have gone through and settled on the fact of what they're going to stop, but now they need to move forward. Your job as a leader during this phase is to start to really be the primary builder of culture. Now, we don't have time for me to go through this. So anybody that wants to, you can email me and I'll give you these slides. And I also encourage you, if you haven't already read The Turnaround Pastor by Dr. Don Ross, it's well worth the read. So the deconstruction phase is now you're deconstructing some of yesterday's solutions. Isn't this just exciting? You got people to pay the bill to build this solution, and now you've got to deconstruct some of those. But listen, part of the culture that we need to help people to gain is growing churches tear down. They're going to need to tear down tomorrow what they built today. We need to set that. Isn't this a great building? We're going to tear it down. In about 10 years, we're going to tear it down because we're going to need more space. Or whatever that thing is, we need to set the expectation that whatever it is just a tool for the mission. It doesn't need to become the mission in and of itself. That's what causes decline. So this is a necessary part of building a new culture, is helping people hold things with a loose hand so that you don't just repeat that cycle very quickly. So then we have the reconstruction phase. Now we're building new things. So in this phase, we're starting to really help define and move things forward in the way that we're going. Now in the production phase, this is where you can start to really gain upward momentum. You're starting to really see the results. You're gaining kingdom traction. People start getting really excited again. Where it was before really hard work, now people are starting to get really excited and feel really good about what's happening. And the last phase is reproduction. Every living thing reproduces, and we need to reproduce as a church. One of the reasons churches stagnate and get inwardly focused is because they're only concerned about what's happening there. Can I just encourage you, if you're in a turnaround situation or if you're starting a brand new church, you should have somewhere in your strategic plan, when are we starting the next one? So that will be the next session. How do we plant churches? So every living thing reproduces, and part of a healthy church culture is a mindset that we're going to reproduce at some point. So we'll talk about that in the next session. I know that we have condensed a lot into a very short time, and I thank you for your attention. If you want to know more, you can pick up one of these, go to the website as well, and we would love to have you in a Turnaround Church cohort. I'll be around between sessions if you want to ask any questions, and anybody who emails me, I'll send the notes.